Okay, now we can talk about muscles. So muscle tissue is found in every organ. They participate in every activity that requires movement, converting chemical energy or ATP into mechanical energy or movement. A large proportion of your body weight is muscle, so approximately 40% of body weight in males is muscle, and 32% of body weight in females is muscle. And then smooth and cardiac muscle make up approximately 10% of our body mass. So definitely a large proportion of our body is muscle. We have multiple functions of our muscular system. You need body movement, getting you from one place to the other. Maintenance of posture, making sure that you're straight in your back. Respiration, your diaphragm moves up and down. Production of heat, this is a byproduct of movement. Communication, so being able to move your jaw and your tongue and your throat. Constriction of organs and vessels, and your heartbeat. Lots of different functions of the muscular system. And these all come along with 3 different types of muscle. We have cardiac muscle that contracts to pump blood, skeletal muscle, which attaches to your skeleton to provide strength and mobility, and smooth muscle, which contracts to move food in your digestive tract or change your diameter of your blood vessels to help conserve or emit heat. And we have different properties of muscles. We have contractility, which is the ability to pull on attachment points to shorten with force. That's what happens when you flex your body, or flex your muscles, I should say. Excitability, the capacity of a muscle to respond to a stimulus. So this delta means change of an electrical state, and send the electrical wave along the length of a membrane. We'll get to this a little bit more when we start talking about the functional unit of a skeletal muscle. And then we have extensibility, which is the ability to stretch or extend. And elasticity, which is the ability to return or recoil to the original length following a stretch. These are all different properties of muscle. So when we're talking about the structure of skeletal muscle, we have fibers that run the length of a muscle, in most cases 10 micrometers to 2.5 feet for the case of a sartorius muscle in your hamstring. They're multinucleated because cells are fused during embryonic development. And so they have lots of mitochondria as well due to high energy demands. Like we said when we were talking about the cell lecture, we were talking about how muscle cells would need lots of mitochondria so that they can do all the different contractions and movements and things that are really high in energy demands. These fibers are long, cylindrical, and then they develop from myoblasts, so their numbers remain constant. They will increase in size, but not number. And this is called hypertrophy. We'll get to that more toward the end of this. Might hear my cat yelling in the background. She's chatty. And then also skeletal muscles are striated and kind of look like fish scales. And we'll get to why that is when we start talking about some more of the histology here. So when we're looking at the histology of muscle cells, we can see at the base level, myofibrils contained in one muscle fiber, and that one muscle fiber is contained in a fascicle, and those fascicles are contained within the skeletal muscle. All right, so I kind of broke that down here for you. Think of it as the organ contains a bundle of cells, which contains a cell, which contains sarcomeres end to end, which we'll get to shortly, and those contain actin and myosin. So this is a good slide to go back to after we've talked about all the science jargon after this, so you can come back and summarize things, be like, all right, which part was which and where am I at in the cell? What am I talking about when I'm talking about a bicep contracting? Like, what am I talking about? So the muscle contains fascicles, which contain fibers, which contain myofibrils, which contain myofilaments. This will become more clear as we go. So, skeletal muscle fibers. There are certain anatomical things we need to discuss before we start talking about how a muscle contracts. So a sarcolemma is simply the plasma membrane of muscle fibers, okay? So it's kind of an extension of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is basically a modified smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcolemma is kind of this casing around a single muscle fiber or muscle cell. Fiber and cell can kind of be interposed, interused within this. So if I say muscle fiber, I'm saying the same thing as muscle cell. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of muscle cells. And so you see the sarcolemma surrounding all these myofibrils, and the sarcoplasm is the kind of like the cytoplasm inside these muscle fiber cells. And then the sarcoplasmic reticulum, if you ever see abbreviated SR, that's what we're talking about, just like ER, but it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, SR. It stores, releases, and retrieves the calcium ions, which are used in the contraction of muscles. We'll get to that more here shortly. Just know that when we're talking about calcium in muscle cells, this is where they're released from, and this is also where they're stored. So that's what kind of surrounds a single myofibril. You'll see sarcoplasmic. So here's this myofibril brought down here. The sarcoplasmic reticulum kind of covers it a little bit. And the sarcomere is, as it shows here, the functional unit of a skeletal muscle, and it's highly organized, and it's containing actin and myosin. And so the thin discs, these green lines, are the actin, and the thick filaments are myosin. So we have thin ones, which are actin, and we have thick ones, which are myosin. Okay, so thin and thick, actin and myosin. And these Z discs, which we'll get to here shortly, kind of signify the end of a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is everything in between here. This basically either extends or contracts, basically, to move the muscle. As myofibrils contract, the entire muscle cell contracts. Because myofibrils are only approximately 1.2 micrometers in diameter, hundreds to thousands, each with thousands of sarcomeres, can be found inside one muscle fiber. All right, so hundreds to thousands of myofibrils can be found in one muscle fiber cell. And the myofibrils are what change in number to increase the size of a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. The muscle cell number never changes in your lifetime. The myofibril numbers can change. And so a sarcomere, like we just said, that's the contractile unit. So this is kind of signifying a little bit different representation of what we were just looking at. These green lines are the actin, and the darker ones are myosin. And so you can kind of see this is myosin, and this is actin, the orange line at least. The actin is the thin filament, and the myosin is the thick filament. Z lines are the attachment points for sarcomeres. So they're, again, the ending or the end lines for the sarcomeres. They're the lateral border of those sarcomeres. That's these Z lines. A sarcomere is a segment of myofibril that extends from one Z line to the other. So this is one sarcomere. Arrangement of filaments gives rise to striated appearance of skeletal muscle. Okay, so this arrangement of different filaments gives the so like actin, myosin, actin, myosin, actin, and it kind of just keeps going like that. That's what gives the striated appearance of muscle cells. And so what we're kind of getting at here is the actin and myosin move on each other in order to contract the muscle cell. So an individual muscle cell contracts and relaxes. The muscle contraction is when each sarcomere shortens a little bit. This is the basic process of contraction. We'll keep referring back to this as we go through the process of contraction. There are steps that happen after contraction, but for contraction itself, this is what we need to know. First, the skeletal muscle has to be activated by a nerve. So a motor neuron has to elicit the activation of the skeletal muscle to contract. The nerve activation increases the concentration of calcium ions, this is key, in the vicinity of the contractile proteins. The contractile proteins were the actin and myosin. Okay, actin in, myosin in. Those are proteins, ins. Actin and myosin are the contractile proteins. Calcium ions in the vicinity of those are increased when the nerve tells it to. So the nerve activates the muscle cell. The presence of calcium permits contractions. So as long as there's calcium, we're still contracting. When nerve stimulation stops, contraction stops. In other words, when nerve stimulation stops, calcium stops flooding, and then the contraction can stop.